implemented are laws of children language. Political correctness assumes that there are good words and bad words, and like children we are told avoid the bad words and say the good words. But this is children's language. Adult language functions in a much more complicated way, and this does not guarantee that when we say the good words we will say something good, and it does not guarantee that when we say bad words we will necessarily say something bad. I want to illustrate this with a little personal experience. 10 years ago, 2006, I was invited very honorably by the British Society of Phenomenology, who dedicated their yearly assembly to the work of philosopher Slavoj Žižek. Already by then we had been good friends for more than a decade, and it was a very interesting conference. Žižek himself was present, and there were many very good papers given upon his philosophy, and he commented upon it, and it was a very lively conference. And in the end, the last coffee break, Žižek had to leave, and we were standing at the window with our coffee cups, and by coincidence I was the last in the row. Žižek shook hands with everybody, these scholars, and we were standing there in a line. But in a way, I was the only personal friend of his. And he said to everybody, goodbye, thank you, goodbye, thank you. And when he came to me, he said, and fuck you. And as you can imagine, that made me incredibly proud. Because he did not just use a polite formula like to everybody, short acquaintances, but he showed that I was his real friend and that we speak the language of our hearts and true friendship. So, what he showed was that the bad word can be used in a very good way. The form was extremely friendly, and only the bad word in this case could communicate this friendly form. So he had to use the bad word in order to produce this very friendly form. This is a mechanism that psychoanalysis has explored, but it is a mechanism that otherwise is also very familiar to all of us in everyday life. Imagine that I would tell you, you can be completely assured, you can sit here safely, it's all safe. Yeah? You would immediately be unassured. You know? My attempt to assure you would unassure you. You know? And that's again this problem of content and form, or to put it in a psychoanalytic structure, we could say, what I say, assuring sentences, is contradicted by the fact that I say it at all. The fact that I say it contradicts what I say. And this is the criterion for a problem that has bothered Freud, and I think only Lacan has found the key clue to this problem, what in psychoanalysis has to be called negation. Sigmund Freud wrote this 1925 paper, Negation. Patients telling, oh doctor, I don't know who this mother in my dream might be, who this figure in my dream might be, I think it's not the mother. And then Freud says, then we can immediately conclude that it's the mother. And that makes psychoanalysis a bit a suspicious practice. No? One could say, okay, this is a practice where whatever you say means the opposite. And that would be a bit suspicious unless we provide a criterion when does it mean the opposite. And the criterion has been given by Lacan. I render it here in a more philosophical language that I have already used. The criterion is precisely negation happens when the content contradicts the form, or when the content is contradicted by the form, or when what you say is being contradicted by the fact that you say it. No? At this moment, when the analyst doesn't ask, is it the mother, this guy just says, the mother it is not, all out of this nothing. That's just as contradictory as if I would tell you, you can sit here safely, nothing happens. So it's out of nothing. So the form would contradict the content, and that's precisely the key to negation. It's not necessarily a not or any negation symbol, any logical symbol as Freud assumed. It is rather the contradiction between what you say and the fact that you say it at all. And I think this is also the clue to this quotation of Juvenal that I have presented in the beginning. Do not sacrifice bare life, do not sacrifice in the name of bare life the reasons for living. We could translate this into Epicurean or Freudian language as such. We have to live in a lively way. We do not only have to live, but the form of living has to be lively. Again, here we must not fall into the trap of contradicting form and content. And that would mean to sacrifice everything just for life. Then we would, on the level of form, kill life. If we sacrifice everything just to preserve life, we would, I don't know, not have sex, not go out into the street, never do anything that is fun. So that would already resemble death. So, of course, there remain a few very stunning and surprising questions with this description of reality into which I inserted this Juvenal question. First stunning question, of course, regarding ourselves and our contemporaries is the question, why are people not spontaneously hedonist? Why are they not spontaneously striving for pleasure? Why is it possible at all that people, even with the feeling of liberation, hail prohibitions and warnings and say, it's good that they warn me from adult language. I could have stumbled into this trap and watched Haneke, and then some nasty word would have killed me on the spot. And of course, even Freud himself, in some of his writings, follows this narrative that people are spontaneously hedonist, only some privileged others might achieve higher goals, but the masses are mostly uneducatable, and only with lots of efforts by culture they can somehow be dragged into doing something productive and not only watching the football and porn or whatever. But on materialist grounds, we have to be more pessimistic here, even than this image that already looks a bit pessimistic. But if we look at this from an Epicurean or Juvenalian position, we have to say things are even worse. People hate nothing as much as pleasure in the first place, and they are grateful for every pretext that allows them to escape from their pleasure. Why is that so? Why are people anti-hedonist? Why are they pleasure hostile? Well, look a little bit at our pleasures. We have parties where we dance as if there were no tomorrow. Of course, this means that it costs recreation. We can't sleep, we will be not so awake tomorrow. It also costs money. We have to be generous and invite people in. We have to spend a lot of money for all the wine that allows the people to get seriously drunk. If we drink the alcohol, it will damage our liver and so on. So apparently many of the things that we find pleasant have some very malign or negative component. Even the most harmless and nice pleasures like listening to music or going for a walk in nature have this malign dimension. They imply a waste of time. It's not the normal economy of time that we can follow in our everyday practice. You cannot say, I go for a walk, but I'll be back in like 17 minutes sharp. That's not a walk. So, I think I follow here some arguments provided by Georges Bataille, French philosopher, who investigated this in his works in the 30s. There is quite a necessity of this malign element, of this negative element in all our sources of pleasure. Of course, it is possible to remove or to attempt to remove the malign element. We can have, for example, beer without alcohol, or we can have coffee without caffeine, or we can have sex without bodily contact, or at least without naked bodily contact. Maybe you remember that in American movies this has now appeared more and more. This seems to become a kind of mass phenomenon, what is called dry humping. People stay within their clothes. But we can also remove other malign elements from other things. We can have universities without intellectualism, or we can have politics without decision making, or we can have arts without genius. But of course, what immediately sticks into our eyes then is that if we remove this negative element, the whole thing becomes totally boring and not anymore a source of pleasure. So we are thoroughly unable to celebrate an adult person's birthday, for example, only with healthy drinks, juice and beer without alcohol. That's not an adult person's birthday. So what we do and what gives us this pleasure is the fact that we celebrate. This is, I think, a very important finding of cultural theory, that celebrating is a practice that allows us to deal with this malign element in our sources of pleasure, and that celebrating is precisely what turns the malign element into a source of sublime pleasure. So even if I don't want to have a beer for breakfast or so, and even in the afternoon I might be a bit reluctant, in the evening when, for example, we have a beer at the roof bar, this beer in my hand becomes a proof that life is worth living, and then celebrating turns the malign element into a sublime one. Then it is real pleasure, and I feel life is worth living, the best pleasure that I can have, and it precisely relies on these two elements, that there is alcohol in the beer and that we are celebrating, which allows me to transform the malign element into a sublime one. I have also claimed with regard to psychoanalytic theory that precisely this process is what merits the name of sublimation. You know that this is a bit of a problem in Freud's theory. Sublimation is a borrowed term that he did not introduce himself, and it already indicated before something that instead of whatever indulging in opulent sex, you just write a poem or something. And then they thought maybe that's sublimation. But of course, even the history of modern art teaches us that it can't be like that. What would you say about art that looks like Jeff Koons or Otto Mühl, or where the artwork itself is a sexual act, and so it's not necessarily with less sexual thought that the artwork takes place. So sublimation must be something different, and to make it short, I would say it is precisely this, when a malign element in culture is, through celebrating, turned into a sublime element. You may also remember here the little quotation and the reference that Sigmund Freud makes in his paper from 1919 on uncanny to the German poet Heinrich Heine. Heinrich Heine has this wonderful little novel, Gods in Exile. It's a novel that happens in Austria, not very far from Linz, where I teach. There are some lakes, and at night a ferryman is hired to bring some bit fearful people, threatening people to some island in that lake, and only after a while he finds out that these people are the Greek gods. They now look more like demons, and the story goes like this, that it's the fallen gods, because we have stopped to venerate the Greek gods, and that's precisely how they became demons. And I think this is, in a way, in a nutshell, this concept of celebration. And it also renders nicely what Sigmund Freud has observed, the ambivalence of the sacred. In all languages, except for German, the sacred has two notions, the sacred and the holy. The holy is always this nice, pacified sacred, but the sacred is more this magic or the demons and all these nasty things. And so this is this profound ambivalence of the sacred. And celebration or veneration is precisely what allows us to shift from one side to the other. If we celebrate the Greek gods, then they become sublime gods and they are wonderful. If we stop celebrating them, they fall and they become demons. So we could also say, that's the optimistic line from this story, there are no other demons than the gods that we have ceased to venerate.